we do another round of applause for that
Thank
amazing
you.
film?
Thank you. It's very bright.
I want to just thank Emily Zinn and Tyler Morgenstern for their amazing work making this event possible. It runs so smoothly here. It's amazing. But what an honor to have this conversation with you. So I was telling Shu Lea that I first saw the film in 1994 when it first came out, and I was a student. I was a graduate student, and the film stayed with me because it takes so long to unpack it all, right? Like there's so much going on. And I left that place intellectually charged. I felt revved up. And the cameos with Jessica Hagedorn and Karen Finley, right? It captures the 80s and 90s in a way that I think is phenomenal. It feels so New York. And there's a way in which all of that is happening. But it also captures the frenetic energy, connections, and convergences like globalization, late capitalism, environmental destruction, and the AIDS HIV epidemic, which is, I think, kind of in the background. So I wonder if you can kind of speak to the genesis of the film and what made you bring all of that chaotic energy together in creating this film, and especially the way you wove all of it together.
Right. So the film was made between 1992 and 1993, and in a certain way kind of sums up the 80s. And I lived through the 80s in New York. And as you say, 80s is actually, of course, we have AIDS epidemic. At the same time, it's in New York City is for me it's a field of activism. There is also a sort of transition to the video technology, the portable, accessible video technology. So everybody is out on the street doing documentation. We call ourselves sort of media activists. So, it's the first time that activists can actually handheld the camera and documenting our own movement rather than relying on the mainstream media who always lie about how many people participate in demonstration. So there's many different elements. Of course, racially is also quite, there's tons of different friction, particularly, I was joking about at the time in the 80s, like it's the first time the Hollywood realized the so-called, they would do the so-called non-traditional casting, meaning that you can now cast non-white people in the film, doing dishwasher or, the security guards. So, the film kind of play on this non-traditional casting. As you can see, the racially is pretty messed up. So there's so many, I think by making this film is a way for me to try to sort out all these different threads of narrative, and of course the homelessness, the economic situation, the environmental racism. There's just so many issues engaged, and in a way that, ambitiously try to see how I can sort of thread everything together. Yeah.
And I think the way that you do that actually gives us a kind of methodology of understanding globalization, right? Like you're training us while you're watching the film of how to make these connections and how to think through what are kinds of, it's a very New York film, but it's also a very global film. Like how do we think of ourselves as being on islands, but also connected from one island to another, whether it's Manhattan to Staten Island to Orchid Island, right? There's a kind of way in which you're weaving a new geography for us to be part of that. But there's also refusal in there of some of those things, or how fragmented and hard it is, right? Like we get segments of the African Unity Network that comes in, we get the sign held about refuse the waste. And I think you make possible the visible trajectories that we could create of solidarity and activism. Yeah. And do you feel that it's still possible now? Do you feel that energy now and what you felt then, right? Because I think, again, that 30 years, how do you see it then and what you saw was possible and what do you see now?
Yeah, thank you for this question, particularly because as we say that this is really our last stop from the 21 city traveling across the country. in a certain way, when I decide to take on this trip, in a certain way, I say, 30 years ago, maybe the film was always being called like ahead of its time, or, you know, for me, ahead of its time, meaning at the time I couldn't really find a proper distributor, I couldn't really, you know, have a stepstone into my next movie. So 30 years later, this trip, you know, by traveling and taking the film print city by city, doing hand delivery to the projection booth, and in a certain way, we're finding this audience. In another way, we are actually trying to sort of make a testify ourselves, like say, is the film still relevant today? And I think the question about do I still feel energized or socially engaged or even motivated or the being activist, I think this trip, at this final day, at this conclusion of the trip, at this final screening, I would say yes.
I'm glad to hear that. And I have to say, and that was my next question, is like, how did this trip happen, right? Like, so we got it, like, how did you get the film reissued?
Yes.
And what was the process of that happening? Because it seemed to come, you know, because I love this film. I've had it on VHS, I've watched it many times. And to see that it's getting reissued in 35 millimeter was like a gift.
Right.
And so what was the process for that? And tell us about this road trip.
Okay. I have my archive at the NYU with the Fales library, with the, it kind of belongs to this special collection, which collect all the, pretty much the work from the downtown, New York downtown performance art scene. And since the film actually gathered together a lot of amazing performance from that theater scene, performance scene in New York at the time. And somehow over the last few years, like the film started getting some, you know, it's still showing here and there. And finally, you know, I was quite concerned about getting the film remastered. And the NYU got a grant, a New York, I think it's a Film Preservation Foundation grant. So this was since like 2015 to take quite a few years to kind of work it through. So the process is going back to the original negative, which is shot in 35 millimeter, to have a 4K scan, and from the 4K scan to make these 35 millimeter print. So by last year, we pretty much say, okay, the film print will be released in 2024. Basically, we pretty much just finished it this year, beginning of this year, to have all the color corrected, color correction and everything. So since last year, me and my cinematographer, Jen Castle, have mentioned about like, oh, we should take the film on the road trip. And I thought, wow, what a romantic idea. It sounds like kind of crazy, absolutely crazy. And, but always I was thinking that me and the cinematographer would do this road trip together. But by the end of last year, Jen decided that she's now went back to her own country in Australia, and she decided she's such an environmental activist now, so she cannot take the flight. And so, which put me by myself, and I was thinking like, am I doing this road trip or not, you know? And finally I say, well, I should probably still try, and I was trying to, you know, ask people to say, am I crazy to think about doing this road trip? And then I met Jean-Paul Jones at Faraday Seminar last year, and he sort of, you know, he saw my films and he liked it, and he kind of came at me, and because I was talking about this road trip, and he just say, I'm gonna be your driver. And I was like, interesting. So I guess because of that, I was like, since I have a driver, I guess I have to make the road trip.
Well, and you picked up another passenger on the way as well.
Yes, and along the way, I figured that we should somehow get the, you know, sort of document this road trip. So I saw Jess Franklin's works, the films. She's from New Orleans. She's based in New Orleans, and I really like her work. She belonged to this street poetry documentation collective, and so her work is beautiful. And so I invite her to join. But by the time we get on the road, we realize we were confirmed that the film is not going to be about the road trip, but it will be between John Paul Jones and jazz, to sort of make a kind of in conversation, a film in conversation with Feshkill.
And when can we expect that one?
Oh, no pressure, no pressure.
I want to say that your work has often been called prescient, right? Not only because it's sci-fi and kind of anticipating its futurity, but I think it does anticipate a kind of dystopic present that we're in. And I want to suggest perhaps it's also of its time, because I think you, like other speculative feminists of color, have been paying attention and could see the potential futurities that were there. I think there's an article where you say, well, things are catching up to me, and they're not caught up yet, right? Because your work is always seen as being ahead of the time, but I think it's because you're paying attention and you're seeing what is happening now. And I think, like speculative fiction writer Octavia Butler has also been called, seen that way. And I notice that while people discuss your work as sci-fi, rarely do interviewers ask you about the ways in which it's Asian and Asian American in that speculative or sci-fi. And I say this because some of your work is kind of riffed on Blade Runner, which is known for its techno-orientalism, and the way that a lot of sci-fi sees Asianness as a possibility of what our dystopic future might be, and always sets it in an Asian setting, or in some Asian element, but erases all the Asian people from it. And there's something about the ways that you kind of place Asian American and Asian Pacific and Asian vision of what a futurity could look like back in. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that way that we're going to talk about queer cinema, but also that it's a kind of Asian futurity that you're imagining as a sci-fi at the very base in some ways.
I actually, when you talk about Blade Runner, after Feshkill, I made this film IKU, which was released in 2000. And that film was shot in Tokyo, and I kind of take off. I called it a takeoff from Blade Runner. It actually take off from the last scene of Blade Runner when Deckard and Rachel went into the elevator and all that. So the film IKU, my second feature, was also shot in Tokyo. But it's true. I think by the time I got to Tokyo and I realized, I was like more like, wow, we have lived the future. I think in Asia country you would say we have lived the future in the sense that the way that science fiction film, particularly in Hollywood, and try to catch up with these sort of dystopia or the kind of glittering of the neon lights, let's say glittering of neon lights or image and all that. But in Asia country, I think it's already kind of went through it. So in that sense, in terms of my approach to science fiction, it doesn't really have. It's almost like anti-science fiction or reverse of the science fiction in a way. Yeah.
In what ways?
In terms of reverse, meaning, I've done a lot of work, I would say, along the way of reverse engineering. So if science fiction is speculative, is about sort of predicting what the future would look like, and at the same time, I would say I turn it around and looking for history to, sort of retro future, yeah.
And I think that's, there's a way in which time is always nonlinear in the way that you do it, and kind of a queer approach to time, that you refuse this kind of linearity of this is where we end, because things seem to go back and forth. Yeah. And I have another question, but I'm going to jump ahead one question. Feshkill has one of my favorite whimsical lesbian sex scenes, right? I love the accordions, the scene. And it emerges in a moment when there's an explosion of lesbian-produced porn. It comes in a moment when we're kind of wrestling the camera in a way. And I want you to, could you talk about why you did it in this film, right, the way, and how that came to you and what that meant, and also how your films have gotten more sexually explicit since then, and kind of that trajectory of, you know, where you start in Fresh Kill and where you end up in some of your other work.
Yeah, I think by early 90s, actually, I have done another installation called Those Fluttering Objects of Desire, which was shown at the Whitney Biennial in 1993. And that work, I bring together about, 16 female artists, and also I did some audio work. But with 16 female artists, we were making sort of self-portrait in a way. Anyway, it's an installation, but it was done in such a way wanting to reverse the male gaze. So I pretty much hand the camera to the filmmaker, to the artists themselves, and making these self-portrait in a way. So I think at the same time, being mostly engaged in media activism, and I do feel like, in our circle, we don't really talk about sex. At the same time, I think if we say we lived through the 80s, in the same time you had these media activists, we don't talk about sex. At the same time, we were so engaged with the ACT UP, with the AIDS epidemic. We were in the middle of that, but almost like the epidemic has killed us, like in terms of like, later I make my third feature film called Fluid Zero, which is totally about the fluid in the AIDS epidemic in a way. So the way I look at sex at the time in this particular film, I think it's still quite, in a way, maybe it's a bit timid, still I want to get in there, but I didn't, really know how to quite in, but I'm trying to mix the sex into a bigger society in a way, yeah.
But it's clear that that even amidst all of the kind of harm that's going on, the kind of devastation, there's a lot of joy, and there's a lot of kind of, or intimacy, right? Like the film refuses not to kind of be in the everyday and experience the intimacy between the two women, between the daughter, right? And so there's a way that, especially when you're thinking about HIV/AIDS and ACT UP and the movement where people are dying, that there's some emphasis on kind of queer everyday life and queer joy. Right. And I'm wondering, like, does that sensibility carry through, would you say, a lot of your work?
Yes. Maybe in retrospective, I look at this film, it's about building an alternative family. And so in a certain way, because the kind of heterosexual society, the kind of traditional family, the mother-father figures, the very binary figure. And so in this film, the kind of mess up, racially, so the father being Native American, daughter being Asian American, or the mother being black, daughter being white, is already kind of messed up the racial boundary. And of course, the family become the kind of alternative family. The lesbian couples actually, have the Asian guy as a kind of front, But for me, this is it's quite the way I lived at the time, I guess. So it really is this mixed up family in a way. So it is only in this kind of alternative family we find the shelters,
And the care and the joy,
Yeah.
And so part of this, Fresh Kill is part of new queer cinema, and I think you were talking about it as sci-fi new queer cinema in the way that you see your work. And I would say, do you see yourself, and in that wake of adding the sci-fi, of what you're doing through that is hacking gender and sexuality. Right. And in that hacking the algorithms and code of gender and sexuality through media. And are you kind of opening up new queer cyborg possibilities of the family, of pleasure, of sexuality, of solidarity in this work and then the kind of subsequent work, especially in that kind of trajectory that you're talking about?
Yeah. Of course, new queer cinema is actually coined by B. Ruby Rich.
Yes.
This was published in 1993 when she first wrote about the new queer cinema, which included mostly Izzy Julian, Ta Hans, Rose Trosh, and pretty much the independent queer scene. So by 2000, when I released IKU, Be Ruby Rich also wrote about IKU when it was first premiered at Sundance, and eventually also collect IKU in the book New Queer Cinema, the director's cut, which didn't get published until 2003. So I was quite honored to be part of this genre, New Queer Cinema. And, but at the same time, I think my film turned into more sci-fi, more, in a certain way, more, I call my film like cyberpunk. There's all these different genres, different descriptions I try to label myself rather than being just labeled as experimental. So with all these different terms, I try to kind of describe my own work. Like last year, 2002-03, I came out with this new film called Yuki, and again, I was trying to describe what the film would look like and decided to call it the sci-fi viral or reality cinema. So it's like, you know, it's complicated. So after that, you know, finally I realized, say, wow, okay, what would, you know, somehow in 30 years I made 4 feature films, you know, somehow accidentally, and I think as a woman, as an Asian, as queer, it's always quite, you know, every film takes such a long effort to make, you know. Fui Zero took me 17 years, Yuki took me 13 years. Yeah, time passed. And so I finally say to myself, maybe, you know, looking back at these 4 films, if there is something in common, you know, will be, I give it a term called sci-fi new queer cinema. So adding the sci-fi in the new queer cinema category, so yeah.
And I would say that I think where you're taking it, right, in like where do you see new queer cinema going now?
Wow. Where the new queer cinema? Of course, if you look at that generation of new queer cinema, and of course, I think nothing stayed new, because the new is always involved a whole new generation. Yeah, yeah. So there's always a new generation of new queer cinema, I would say, yeah.
I wanted to come back to the film is so fascinated with waste, and it tries to make sense of like stink and the detritus of globalization. There's trash everywhere. The theme resurfaces again and again, the idea of the US nuclear bomb that's not detonated, the kind of fresh kill landfill, and the way that the garbage is kind of present, you know, that isn't unavoidable, right? Like it's just part of, even it's part of the art exhibit in there. Part of the detritus of globalization, of capitalism, of commodity culture. And there's a way in which there's not a, you know, an out from the consumption, but there are these moments of trying to wrestle with it. And I'm thinking of the kind of sex toy show that's happening on the, that Mimi's hosting when she's talking about here, the sex toys. And the kind of living within late capitalism, living with the detritus of that. Can you speak to like how we're navigating the trash of what's around us, or what Fresh Kill says about how we best navigate that? Because I think it's very clear that we're making and doing what we can almost as scavengers, right? Of like with the television stacked up, and the way that the trash is both material and metaphorical for the landscape we're in.
I'm quite obsessed with trash, I guess. So Fresh Kill mainly deal with industrial waste. You know, at the time, I think in terms of the one-way trafficking of the industrial waste, so the Manhattan dumps the waste onto the Staten Island. Taiwan government dumps nuclear waste on Orchid Island. So in a way, the film actually reversed that circulation by having these toxicated fish lips come back to haunt the city people. I continue to be quite obsessed with the way. So in 2003, my new film actually deals with particular electronic waste, particularly electronic waste dumping in Africa. And in 2015, I have a chance to go to Africa to do the research on the e-waste. And it is quite amazing sight to see how we have accumulated so much waste, because everybody wants to update your mobile phone. We have so much update going on. At the same time, if you think about the whole slogan, I mean, almost like a slogan about recycle, about going green, the way that we are kind of living off of this principle still today, 30 years later, even more so, that you now have a whole organic section in the supermarket, you're totally green. So interestingly, of course, the waste is never gonna go away. And in a way, in Africa, when you see people are harvesting a little metal from the e-waste and, or whatever recycle. I mean, here we talk about recycle and all these terms, but it seems like we still cannot deal with these huge amount of the debris, and maybe it's also the human legacy,
And it's environmental racism, right? Like what you're showing in the film of who's most impacted, who's most exposed in that way. I also think that there's the way that you kind of capture our contaminated futures, that thinking about that it's a moment of HIV/AIDS epidemic, that there's also radiation, but we're all contaminated. We're all facing pandemics. There's always irradiation. What might we learn about how we're living with the fallout about environmental harm, but that we're still living, right? It's not that there's a purity. We're now living post many pandemics, and our DNA is changing. We're very cyborgian in that we're contaminated. We have microplastics. I mean, in so many ways, you anticipate so much of how we're actually thinking about ourselves in a kind of dystopic world, but we're not giving up, right? And I think there's something about the film that really doesn't give up in the face of all that.
Maybe I come back to this word recycle, because when we talk about recycle, it seems we don't even know where it gets recycled to, right? Whenever you see a city who really know how to sort of separate your garbage, which bin, and then at the same time, that process of recycle. So maybe in a certain way, I guess the future can be recycled. And in the case of, it goes from, so in FreshQ, I have these toxic fish, and toxic fish with the fish lip become this connoisseur dish, and then comes back to haunt the city people. My other film, Fui Zero, actually deal with the virus get mutated, the AIDS virus get mutated, and again, it's become a sort of commodity as a fluid. My recent film, Yuki, actually deal with the whole virus, and which actually was conceived in 2009 when I started dealing with the virus issues, and I called it, I enter into a cycle of my work as a kind of biohack and viral love. And so by the time I released Yuki in 2002-03, I declared that we all should become virus, virus becoming. And indeed, we have become virus. I think, during the COVID time, either you have the COVID or you take the vaccine, you basically have the virus embedded in you, and we are the virus. And for me, again, virus become a most powerful tool. And it's in virus becoming, I actually, talk about hope, talk about possibility of regenerate, possibility of multiply ourselves, multiply and mobilize. Yeah.
And I think that's so powerful because we're living in a moment when there's lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, right? And so we're taking in that kind of water where we have vaccines that we're exposed to, we have microplastics. And so there's a kind of way in which virus becoming, cyborg, are ways that we have to learn how to be or become in this world, because we're not having a choice about it with the microplastics and so on. And while we're still fighting against environmental racism and fighting for environmental justice, we still have to live. And I think there's a way in which your films capture that this is who's most impacted, but this is the knowledge they have. This is how we're living through that in a way that I think, and how we learn from those who are most impacted. So there's a way in which I think it is an affect of hope that comes through, even in the midst of all the things that you talk about that are devastating to us at our hearts. But at the same time, you seem to really capture how to live. And
I think this question actually kept coming up during our trip, and particularly in the post-screening Q&A. And so many people would ask about, I think in the time that maybe we could be quite desperate, consider the situation is quite desperate. Of course, we have been taking the trip right before the election, and sometimes we turn on the radio, we go through the country and feel in each state, each city, the vibe about the election also, and the certain environmental situation, the racism still exists, and it's ever harsh. Particularly, there's so much agitation going on from what we can read about the current political situation in this country. So one can get so desperate and despair, and every time when we screen the film, and this question about hope, about how do we still resist, will come up. And it's interesting, it's like the audience is asking me for some answer, and I would unable to give the answer. However, I think at the same time, I was very touched throughout this trip is to realize there's always puzzles or activism going on. The puzzles of different resistance, different people, different community. And I really believe in that, these kind of alternative family, alternative community would all come together and make something, having a big breakthrough. I think there's been, different kind of movement kind of have a breakthrough, the Occupy or the campers, many different movements that the young generation are doing, and then we kind of come back to this kind of analog way of activism. By physically, we have to reclaim the space. We have to reclaim many space, the airways, the spectrum, the real space, the campus. Yeah.
But I think that there's a way in which that's why young people are coming to see this film 30 years later and finding that same energy in your films, right?
I hope so. Yeah, I hope so.
That's my sense of my students when I talk to them at this is what they're hungry for. This is what they want, because they see all these connections, and I think it's much easier for students to see that connection now than they did 30 years ago. I feel like I had to lead them to what you were trying to say, where I feel like in the classroom, in the encampments, in the protests, students are making these connections already, and that's why your work resonates so much with the audiences as you're going on this road trip, I imagine.
Yeah.
It's not my generation. I mean, we're already there with you, but I think you've caught a whole new generation of film lovers.
I do feel like, when I say, when people ask me why this road trip, and sometimes I would answer, say, well, I'm looking for an audience, and I find you, then I'm happy.
Well, I'm glad you came to UCSB
Yes.
for that. And I would say that at the same time, I wonder if there's something about the film where it's like we're connecting through the internet. We're finally able to see and find out what's going on in Africa, right? Like the Africa Unity Network. The media has changed, right? The internet, our connectivity has changed in 30 years. In some ways, we're inundated. And part of what, talking to my kids, talking to youth, it's like we can't turn it off. And that's also what's so hard about it. And so I'm curious in what your experience and how you think about that ambivalence of media. And I think your work speaks so much. We're seeing the possibilities of connection here, but there's also constant surveillance going on. There's the constant technology, but there's a real way in which it's both a connecting and a disconnecting. And where you're sitting with that now, considering that at each and every iteration of your work, you've, I think, dove deeper into thinking about what technology, what media can do, and how it shapes us.
Thanks. Actually, the film, making it in early 90s was the kind of right before the internet or the so-called net art. Of course, we were already using the network technology, but at the time, I think what we would say, like we were using this BBS, like a broadcast bulletin system. So a lot of the dialogue, actually come from being on BBS would be like the same social network you're on today. At the same time, I think the internet has not really arrived yet. I think I didn't get onto the internet until right after I finished this film in 1994. I actually at the time decided to call the film Eco-Cybernoia. And so it's like, interestingly, coming back to think about this cybernoia as paranoia. It's the feeling, the sense of paranoia about what would come if the cyberspace arrive, if this network situation, and then of course the hacking, the infiltration, the kind of there's so many different layers of hacking in this film. I think coming back to think about it, it really worked with the whole avant of technology, and at the same time embracing the technology, at the same time feel the infiltration, the intervention that we can do with the technology. I think as the time progressed, I continue learning new technology. I always been really want to update myself. I think it's this desire to have the I would say a lot of technology for me I consider as a white man's toys. And so I was like, wow, I really have that desire to access these toys. And so I would, borrow it, steal it, hack it in this way to get to that technology. So I continue doing so. So, yeah, with my new work, actually continue trying to break down some of the barrier of the technical difficulty or the access to technology.
So, well, I hope we'll get a chance to see some of that soon. So I want to thank you so much for answering these questions.
Wow, great. Thank you.
And I'm going to turn it over to Emily to be able to offer the audience an opportunity to ask questions.
Hello.
Hi.
I wanted to ask, one of your short films from around this era, Sex Fish, is already more sexually explicit than this is, which certainly can also be attributed to the short form. But I wonder if you see that this greater extension of sexual presentation being an inevitability in your later work.
Yes. Actually, during the editing of Fresh Kill, I kind of find myself overburdened. it's heavy and politically it's heavy. At the same time, the editing was quite difficult. Luckily, at the time, by 1993, we actually switched to digital editing. But the process of the editing took about a year and was a very difficult process. So to entertain myself, I make sex fish with my partners at the time, and being able to get together all the sort of lesbian couples in New York City, our friends, willing to take out their clothes and perform in bed. And it's just fun. It was a fun piece when we make sex fish. But for me, indeed, it's still kind of, it's almost like coming from fresh kill and take the fish and the sex together become sex fish. In 1994, I did make another installation called Bowling Alley, and which is quite serious installation too. At the same time, I also make another short video called Sex Ball, Bowling and Sex, right? Then I went to Tokyo and I make another 2 lesbian shows called Fingers and Kisses, and Coming Home with the Japanese Dai community. So with these 4 films, sort of kind of pay my way to go toward more sexual expressive films. So by the year 2000, when IKU came out and showing in Sundance, it was announced as a porno film, and was playing at midnight show, and many people walk out. So.
What was the difference in audience reaction that you had to Fresh Kill in 1994 versus being on the road and screening it in 2024? Are people a lot more responsive, I bet, to seeing lesbian sex on stage, on the screen?
Yeah, maybe because, if you come back to look at the sex scene, is just so analog, right? But I think in 1994, the film has quite a limited distribution. It has some good reviews, some bad reviews, but I don't think it got a really wide distribution, so it became kind of sort of hidden, and and I would never imagine 30 years later I could really release the film. And in the beginning, we start screening. I think we have a premiere this April in BAM in New York, the first time with this 35mm print, and we got quite an amazing, chilling, very loud audience, and kind of give me the confidence that the film can find the audience. At the same time, I was playing this road trip, but throughout the screening on this road trip, it's true, I realized, the young audience, the new generation actually was able to accept this movie, maybe even, or understand this movie maybe more than 30 years ago when it first got released.
Yeah. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. Wanted to maybe get more insight on how your media arts practice or your pioneering work in kind of non-linear presentations of cinema, if it's a spatial presentation, how does that relate to this two-dimensional representation that it seems as though it's so, to me, it was extremely layered. And I think to the point, like some of the message collapsed to information to me. Like it became some sort of composition or some sort of artistic work. Can you please comment on that type of palette or visual composition?
I think with all, so I also practice art, it's true. And, so as I said, by 1994, I really got on the cyberspace. I was like, at the time, I feel like I was so hesitant, I really want to, I jump on the cyberspace, the superhighway, and, driving on high speed, and at the same time, because I think at that time, there was actually a slogan from MCI, the telephone company, saying like, there is no race and no gender in cyberspace. And I really believe in it, and I feel like I should really jump onto it and check it out. So, but then pretty soon I take a detour and kind of divert myself into exit, and get out of the cyberspace in a way. The way that I see that the technology advanced, and particularly in the 80s, I think the way we talk about there was supposed to be the 500 channels of cable TV available to us. But then if you look at the 500 channel, if you keep switching television, where you get to, that's just over redundant or non-necessary information in a way. And so the film was kind of doing this kind of channel surfing. Yeah, so you keep channel surfing and you're trying to find the right channel or you go back. I think channel surfing is always going forward, going backward, going forward, going backward. So in a way, the film kind of followed this way of, which way do we go? You can go forward, you go backward, and you switch, and then where you get to, yeah. So that was, of course, I consider the film is still very analog at the time. As the technology advanced, as I started using the internet, it became like my work for the Guggenheim Museum, 1998, 1999, Brandon, which totally, exists on the web for a year. And so at the time, of course, it's also very new for me to say I am presenting an artwork on the web for a year, and time to time I put on different episodes, different story, different episodes. The film, the work kind of extended over a year period of time by adding different interface, different elements to the work. So that was again quite a challenge by taking that medium further. Of course, pretty much by year 2000, 2001, we would declare the internet is dead, or the net art, particularly net art, is dead. I think by 2001, and I sort of got into a sort of post-internet crash period. So maybe for 10 years, all my work I would set up a scenario in post-net crash scenario. By 2009, I declared myself into this viral love biohack cycle and really get into the bioengineering. So until the release of Yuki, I think the virus, the sort of transgenic creatures, like a lot of microbes. So that kind of, I think I consider my work with a different cycle of research. It's sort of research-based, in a way. And by research, I mean in terms of exploring the technical possibility, in exploring how to convey the urgency of certain political and social issues.
Thank you so much for this film and for ending your road trip here. I have we've been talking a bit about the internet era and cyber and everything that you're involved in. I would love for you to go back right now we take for granted everybody makes media. But one of the things that everybody so appreciated about Paper Tiger TV, like kind of some of your earliest origins in that. And just take us back, just say maybe a little about that exuberance. We're not just going to watch TV. We're not just going to watch media. We're going to make media. And it's going to be experimental. It's going to be activist. And actually, a lot of it, too, was tied up in AIDS activism and making AIDS media, too. So I would just love for you to just take us back to give us a sense of that spirit of that first time of that kind of making media activism.
Yeah. So the late 70s really sees the more like a portable video technology. So I started with a kind of open reel video technology. Yeah. At the time, we were based in the Downtown Community TV Center in New York. And the big kind of portable television soon to be replaced by mini DV, different video camera, small video camera, smaller video camera. So when we first get our hands on these cameras, it feels like, wow, you can actually take it out on the street and you can do I don't particularly call myself doing documentary. I would call myself like collecting documents, with these video camera. At the same time, Paper Tiger TV, of course, is one of these programs using the so-called public access TV channel. And this again, because of the, as I talk about the 500 TV channel or the cable TV, normally, legally, every city, when you lay down the cable to have the advance of the technology or having the cable TV channel being so many and running commercial, at the same time, the city is supposed to give the citizen a couple channels or so-called public access, meaning everybody can use it. And so at that time, for example, Paper Tiger TV would have this slogan say, use it or lose it. So we were trying to, I think there is a very nationwide public access TV movement happening. And even artists, culture workers, activists were all using these public access TV to make progress. So maybe everybody would get, different 30-minute slot. And this was a lot of these television is just funny. It's really homemade, DIY, and it could be about any subject matter. Well, I guess today we would talk about TikTok or same thing, the Instagram, the whole social up movement. The question is like, what would be the difference, between these public access TV and today? These kind of YouTubers or whoever, right? Maybe at the time, I think the public access TV have these promise or anticipation of the channel is opening up to us. We can grab the channel. But at the same time, it's really, we are very aware of the political struggle or trying to get hold of this channel or trying to use this channel. So every time we make a program, it is a political act, right? So maybe today, in a certain way, the media access become so easy and we can, really broadcast anytime, streaming anytime. At the same time, maybe the appreciation is very different, isn't it? Yeah.
There's a hyper-local aspect of the cable access, right? Like it's in a place.
Yes.
And I think as opposed to social media, which is almost placeless sometimes.
Yeah,
in its
try to
virality.
think about that. But at the same time, I would say also a bit about the activism. For example, like the different activist movement, using different media, using different technology to advance. So, for example, maybe 2020. When Hong Kong has this biggest bee water movement, and how people were using Telegram to connect with each other, how different sort of cryptology is used to avoid the surveillance. So there's really a fight to try to get hold of available technology which have been developed by different corporations, at the same time try to hack it in a way to reverse it, to use it to our own way of using it, right? So, yeah.
Well, I want to thank everyone, and especially Shu Lea, for
Thank
sharing
you.
not only an amazing film, but just an inspictful conversation.
Thank you for this talk.
No, it
Yes.
was such a pleasure. Another
Thank
round
you.
of applause, please.
Thank you very much.